The Holy Gospel according to Luke. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger? I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he sent off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" The Gospel of the Lord. So a couple of weeks ago, there was a stockbroker who made the news because he was publicly criticizing Ukrainian President Zelensky for wearing a t-shirt instead of a suit during his video address to Congress. He claims that by not wearing a suit, Zelensky was disrespecting both the institution of Congress and the United States and his representation of the Ukrainian people. The stockbroker was roundly criticized for this, of course, but as so many people do these days, instead of gaining more understanding in a wave of criticism, he merely doubled down on his comments. He then went on to say that Zelensky, well, he wasn't in an active battle zone at that time, and he should have just had a suit in his closet next to his t-shirt. He also added that even if he wasn't wearing suit pants, he could at least dress in a suit from the waist up, which was really weird to me, because then it became not about the suit itself, but just the illusion of wearing a suit. And that, to me, doesn't seem like respect at all. So all of this made me think about how people can get to a point where they hold on to something so tightly that they can't let go and nothing else can get through. They become closed off to any other reality. At the beginning of the gospel reading today, the Pharisees and religious authorities are criticizing Jesus for hanging out with what they call sinners. These people are basically described as thieves and sex workers, and Jesus was eating with them, which of course in his time was a hugely important social event, so it was very subversive that he was doing this. But I think it's important to remember that Jesus is not eating with these people to use them as token examples, to say, look, even these lowly people can be saved. And he's not using them to fill his salvation quota for that day. He's eating with them because he loves them. And the religious authorities don't understand this. They can't. They've dedicated their lives to the law, to knowing with absolute confidence about what is right and wrong, clean and unclean. They think they have come as close to being holy as a human can be. And they are holding on to that with all their might. So they basically send the equivalent of angry Facebook comments Jesus' way about the people he's hanging out with. I think we can all imagine what those are like. But the grace and love that Jesus is extending to these people that he's eating with is not something that makes sense to the religious authorities of the day. It's completely the opposite of what they've based their lives around. But it's what made the ministry of Jesus so revolutionary. And it still is revolutionary. Think about the people whom Jesus might be hanging out with today. And one thing I like about Jesus is when the Pharisees get on his case, he often just kind of confuses them with parables. And this parable is so commonly told that it's easy to take for granted what it's saying. But as somebody in Bible study this week pointed out, as we go through Lent every year, it becomes a continual process of renewal and self-discovery. So even though we've been through it before, we can grow each time through the process. So this story is often called the Prodigal Son, but I don't like that title. I would actually call it the Prodigal God. Now, prodigal is not a super common word. I don't think you'll find it in your kids' text messages these days, but it means wastefully extravagant, or spending resources recklessly and lavishly. And the father in this story is certainly extravagant for his lost kid. When the father sees the kid on the horizon, he actually runs to the kid, which means he has to hike up his tunic and run. And so he gives up some dignity by doing this, rather than waiting at his house and letting the kid crawl back to him. And his dignity was already took a hit because of the shame that the son put on the family. And then the father gets all the best resources of the house together, the best clothes, the fatted calf, meaning the best and most food, and there's a big party that's thrown. There's no thought to the cost or what is deserved. There's no dressing down of the son. There's not even a, well, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. So the party ensues, and there's loud music and dancing, and all in the house are invited, which seems like a happy ending. But the story doesn't end there, because there's still someone outside the party. The older brother, who gets angry and refuses to join in. The older brother is the good son, who's been obedient all his life, doing as he was told and never disrespected his family, and certainly not in the way that the younger son did. And he resents the father for using so many resources on the troublemaker. But God, like the parent in this story, extends prodigal grace to everyone. It's extravagant, it's lavish, and some would even say reckless. God runs toward us. When we come saying we're not worthy to even be seen as beloved children, God embraces us instead, just like the Father does in the story. The party's thrown, the music plays, the food is on the table, and we can become full to the brim with grace and love. So what keeps the older brother outside the party? And what makes it so that the religious authorities of the day cannot understand why Jesus is hanging out with this group of sinners? In both cases, there's separation. The older brother refers to the younger brother as your son when he's talking to the father. He's separating himself from his sibling. And the Pharisees clearly don't consider themselves part of the group of sinners that Jesus is eating with. The older brother considers the party to be for the younger brother, but he doesn't get it. He resents it, thinking the party should actually be for him, since he's done everything the right way. But the party that's being thrown is thrown for everyone. There's celebration that the younger sibling is back, but the party is for all in the house. The older brother misses this because he's too focused on what he thinks is deserved or not. He's holding on to what he thinks he's entitled to. This type of thinking keeps us from accepting the grace of God, and it keeps us from God's loving embrace, and it keeps us from becoming full to the brim. The main difference between the two brothers is that the younger brother is aware that he's come to the end of himself. He's hit rock bottom. He knows he screwed up, and that he doesn't deserve to even be considered the father's son anymore. When we come to the end of ourselves, that is where we find the prodigal grace of God. And the older brother never gets there. For all his obedience, he never gets beyond himself. He's still caught up in what he's holding on to, in what he's done or had to endure. He even implies that, I've been working like a slave for you, for his father. He's a good son, not because it's right to be a good son, but because he feels entitled to the rewards as a result of being a good son. And that's the brother's whole problem with the big feast. The younger brother objectively did not deserve the resources that were being used up in his honor. But grace does not concern itself with what is deserved or not. That's what makes God's grace a prodigal grace. It's more than we deserve. It's lavishly given to us regardless of what we've done. So then, if we are called to be vessels of God's love in the world, shouldn't it be our mission to do the same for others, to extend prodigal grace to others? It might be tempting to say, well, that's not fair. It's easy to fall into the trap of being the older sibling in this story. Our entire society is based around that thinking. Read any comment section online about the homeless or the drug addicted, the poor, those struggling with their identity, or simply those in a bad situation because they screwed up. The comments are filled with condemnation and platitudes about what people deserve or don't deserve. And it's easy to villainize a stockbroker that has a bigger problem with the dress code than human rights violations and war, or a Pharisee that thinks that they should get into heaven before a prostitute. But in truth, this is a blind spot that we all have. It's incredibly easy to separate ourselves from each other, to see someone that threatens our preconceived notions or what we're holding on to so tightly as the other. We've been conditioned to think that we're entitled to certain things while other, less deserving people are not. But grace is not something that we can manipulate in our favor. If we try to, we risk not entering into it when something goes against what we are holding on to so tightly. And if we're holding on to those things, then we are unable to hold onto God's embrace. In order to accept grace, we must let go. When I was first thinking about this story, I wanted to go after the Pharisees hard, and the stockbroker, and the older brother types. I wanted to stand up here and say, see, these people are way out of line, which they are. But then I realized I was doing the same thing to them that they were doing to others. I was putting a line between me and them. I would not want to be at the table with them. I was unable to find grace for them, and as a result, would be unable to accept grace myself. What I was holding on to was how angry their attitudes made me. Inside each of us is a reckoning between these two extremes of the brothers. If we try to reckon with these things on our own, we quickly come to the end of what we can do ourselves. And if we're not careful, we may find ourselves refusing to enter the party. Instead, if we allow ourselves to become full with God's grace, we can then use that to fill up others. Imagine our community if we treated each other like the parent treats his children in this story. It would make some people really uncomfortable. Some would accuse us of being wasteful, of being unfair, of encouraging those who didn't follow the rules of how things are supposed to go. But if God is prodigal with grace and love, shouldn't we aim to be the same? To run to those who need help, who have reached the end of themselves? Both brothers in this story tell themselves stories about themselves. The younger brother tells himself a story that because of what he's done, he's no longer worthy to be his father's son. He doesn't deserve the love that his father would give. The older brother says that because of what he's done, he has earned his father's love, and not only does he deserve it, he's entitled to it. And the father tells a different story to both of them. What he tells them is, regardless of what you've done, you cannot earn my love. It's always all there for you. And regardless of what you've done, you cannot be unworthy of my love because it's always there for you. And we may relate to one or both of the siblings in this story, but we're actually called to be like the parent, to let the love of Jesus flow through us in a prodigal way. Like the prodigal God, we must run to those standing on the horizon who feel like they have nothing left. The parent running to the returning child does not think about what the child has done. The embrace is more important. May we learn to accept this extravagant grace, to let go of what we are holding on to so tightly, so that we may empty ourselves for the sake of others to be filled, which will in turn fill us to the brim once again. Amen.